In the autumn of 1842, in the small town of Milledgeville, Georgia, a discovery was made that would shock the entire South and expose one of the most horrifying secrets in American history. When local authorities entered the basement of the Thornton estate, responding to reports of strange sounds coming from the property, they found 23 children living in darkness, filth, and unimaginable conditions. These children, ranging in age from 3 to 16 years old, had been hidden from the world for years, some for their entire lives. What happened in that basement, why these children were hidden, and the dark truth about their identities would reveal a story of cruelty, greed, and systematic abuse that represents one of the darkest chapters of the antebellum South. To understand how 23 children came to be imprisoned in a basement in Georgia, we must first understand the world of 1842 and the particular circumstances that made such a horror possible. This was the height of the plantation system in the American South, a society built on slavery and maintained through violence, legal oppression, and an ideology that viewed some human beings as property rather than people. But the story of the Thornton basement goes beyond even the horrors of slavery itself, revealing something even darker about human capacity for cruelty when profit and power are at stake. The Thornton family had been prominent in Georgia since the late 1700s, when the first Thornton ancestor arrived from Virginia and established a plantation near what would become Milledgeville. By 1842, the family's holdings had grown to include over 2,000 acres of farmland worked by more than 100 enslaved people. The family's wealth came primarily from cotton, that white gold that fueled the Southern economy and demanded ever more labor to plant, tend, and harvest. But the Thornton family had another source of income, one that was whispered about but rarely discussed openly, one that would ultimately lead to the basement full of hidden children. The Thorntons were involved in the internal slave trade, the buying and selling of human beings within the United States. This trade had become increasingly important after 1808, when federal law prohibited the importation of enslaved people from Africa. The domestic slave trade filled this gap, moving enslaved people from the Upper South, where tobacco farming was declining, to the Deep South, where cotton was king, and labor was in constant demand. Marcus Thornton, the patriarch of the family in 1842, was 53 years old and had inherited the plantation from his father in 1825. Marcus was described by those who knew him as cold, calculating, and utterly without conscience when it came to matters of business. He saw enslaved people not as human beings but as units of production and profit, to be bought, sold, worked, and bred like livestock. This attitude was not unusual among slaveholders of the era, but Marcus took it to extremes that shocked even some of his fellow plantation owners. Marcus had a particular interest in what was euphemistically called breeding operations. In the coldest economic terms, it was more profitable to produce enslaved people through forced reproduction than to purchase them. A woman could potentially produce a child every year or two, and each child represented future labor and potential sale value. Some plantations operated systematic breeding programs, forcing enslaved women to bear children who would then be enslaved from birth, never knowing freedom, often separated from their mothers, and sold away as soon as they were old enough to be valuable. But Marcus Thornton saw an opportunity that went beyond standard breeding operations. He realized that there was particular value in children of mixed race, the offspring of white fathers and enslaved mothers. These children, often lighter-skinned, were sometimes sold as house servants or skilled workers for premium prices. But there was a problem with this from Marcus's perspective. Such children were evidence of sexual relations between white men and enslaved women, something that was common but officially denied and socially taboo in the South of 1842. Marcus developed a plan that was as cruel as it was profitable. He would operate a secret breeding operation, hidden from view, where enslaved women would be forced to bear children, particularly children of mixed race, who would then be kept hidden until they were old enough to be sold far away, their origins obscured. The basement of the Thornton mansion became the site of this operation, a hidden prison where women were held, forced to bear children, and where those children grew up in darkness, knowing nothing of the world above their heads. The basement itself was extensive, originally built as storage space for food, wine, and supplies. It consisted of several large rooms with stone walls, low ceilings, and minimal ventilation. There were small windows near the ceiling that let in some light, but these were covered with heavy boards, keeping the space in perpetual twilight. Marcus had the basement modified for his purposes, adding crude sleeping platforms, basic washing facilities, and locks on the doors that could only be opened from outside. The operation began sometime around 1830, as near as investigators could later determine. Marcus began selecting certain enslaved women from his plantation and from others he purchased specifically for this purpose. These women were taken to the basement and essentially disappeared from the world. Official plantation records would show them as having died or been sold, but in reality they were imprisoned beneath the main house, forced to bear children year after year. The children born in that basement never saw daylight in their early years. They were born in darkness, raised in darkness, knowing only the stone walls and low ceilings of their prison. As they grew older, they would be brought out at night occasionally, always under guard, to get some fresh air and exercise to keep them healthy enough to eventually sell. But they were never allowed to interact with other enslaved people on the plantation, never allowed to be seen by visitors, never recorded in any official documents. Marcus employed a trusted overseer named Jacob Carver to manage the basement operation. Carver was a brutal man, known for his cruelty even in an era and place where cruelty toward enslaved people was commonplace. He controlled access to the basement, brought food and supplies, and enforced absolute silence and obedience from the women and children imprisoned there. Anyone who caused trouble or failed to cooperate would be beaten severely or, in some cases, killed as an example to the others. The women imprisoned in the basement lived in conditions of unimaginable horror. They were kept pregnant as often as possible, their bodies treated as nothing more than production machinery. When they could no longer bear children, either due to age or health problems from repeated pregnancies in such terrible conditions, they would be disposed of, buried secretly on the plantation grounds. Marcus kept no records of these women, treating them as if they had never existed. The children grew up in a nightmare world. The younger ones knew nothing else, having never experienced life outside the basement. The older ones, who had been born above ground and then brought to the basement, lived with memories of sunshine and open air that became increasingly dreamlike and unreal. They slept on rough wooden platforms, ate simple food that was often inadequate, and had no education, no play, no childhood in any meaningful sense. They existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting to be old enough to be sold and taken away to some other form of bondage. As the children reached useful ages, typically around 10 to 12 years old, Marcus would sell them through intermediaries to buyers far from Georgia, often in other states. He would provide false documentation claiming they were children of enslaved people from other plantations, obscuring their true origins. Because these children had been hidden their entire lives, there was no one to contradict these false papers, no family to search for them, no record of their existence to challenge the fabricated histories Marcus created. Over the course of approximately 12 years, from 1830 to 1842, Marcus Thornton sold dozens of children through this operation, making substantial profits. The exact number may never be known because Marcus kept no honest records of the basement operation. When authorities finally discovered the basement in 1842, there were 23 children imprisoned there, but this represented only those who had not yet been sold. The total number of children born and raised in that basement, then sold into slavery elsewhere, was certainly much higher. But how was such an operation discovered? How did Marcus's secret finally come to light? The answer involves several factors coming together in the summer and fall of 1842, creating circumstances that would expose the basement and its imprisoned children. The first factor was the arrival in Milledgeville of a northern minister named Reverend William Hastings. Hastings was from Massachusetts and had come south partly out of curiosity about the slavery system he had heard so much about, and partly with some vague notion of perhaps doing missionary work among enslaved people. Hastings was not an abolitionist in the radical sense, but he had moral qualms about slavery and wanted to see the reality for himself. Hastings visited several plantations in the area, including the Thornton estate. Marcus, confident in his ability to present a respectable facade, allowed the minister to tour the plantation and speak with some carefully selected enslaved people who had been coached on what to say. But during this visit, something happened that would plant seeds of suspicion in Hastings's mind. As Hastings was being shown around the main house, he heard what sounded like children's voices coming from somewhere beneath them. When he asked about it, Marcus claimed it was just sounds from the kitchen or perhaps enslaved children playing outside being heard through the walls. But Hastings had the distinct impression that the sounds had come from below, not from outside, and Marcus's explanation seemed nervous and unconvincing. Hastings mentioned this odd occurrence to several people in town, including a local merchant named Samuel Brooks. Brooks had long had suspicions about Marcus Thornton, not because of any moral opposition to slavery, but because of business dealings that had suggested Marcus was involved in some irregular activities. Brooks had heard rumors over the years about strange happenings at the Thornton plantation, about women who disappeared, about Marcus's unusually frequent sales of children to out-of-state buyers, about sounds heard by people who lived near the estate. Brooks shared these rumors with Hastings, and the two men began to compare notes. Hastings spoke with other people in town, carefully and indirectly, not wanting to make accusations without evidence. He learned that several enslaved people who had escaped from the Thornton plantation over the years had told stories about women and children being hidden somewhere on the property, though the specifics were vague, and the stories had been dismissed as the confused tales of runaways trying to justify their flight. The second factor that led to the discovery was a fire. In September of 1842, a small fire broke out in one of the outbuildings on the Thornton plantation. The fire was quickly contained, but it drew the attention of neighbors and townspeople who came to help. During this commotion, several people reported hearing what sounded like children crying or calling out from somewhere near the main house. One woman, the wife of a neighboring plantation owner, insisted she had heard distinct voices saying, "Help us," coming from the direction of the Thornton mansion. Marcus dismissed these reports as confusion caused by the excitement of the fire, but the woman was insistent and began talking to others about what she had heard. Combined with Reverend Hastings's earlier experience and Samuel Brooks's suspicions, a picture began to form in the minds of several Milledgeville residents that something deeply wrong was happening at the Thornton estate. The third and final factor was a brave act by one of the enslaved people on the Thornton plantation. A young man named Isaiah, who worked in the stables, had over the years pieced together some understanding of what was happening in the basement. He had seen Jacob Carver making regular trips to the basement with food and supplies. He had heard sounds from below. He had overheard fragments of conversation between Marcus and Carver about the product, and keeping them quiet. Isaiah understood that there were people imprisoned beneath the house, though he did not know the full extent of the horror. Isaiah also knew that speaking out would likely mean his death. Enslaved people who made accusations against their enslavers were rarely believed, often punished severely, and sometimes killed. But Isaiah had a sister who had been taken by Marcus years earlier and had disappeared, officially sold, but with no record Isaiah could find of where she had gone. He suspected his sister might be one of the women imprisoned in the basement. Isaiah made contact with Reverend Hastings through a complex chain of communication involving other enslaved people and free black people in the area. Getting a message from an enslaved person to a white minister without arousing suspicion required careful planning and the cooperation of several people willing to take risks. But eventually, Isaiah's message reached Hastings. There were people imprisoned in the Thornton basement, women and children, hidden for years, and if someone did not act, they would remain there until they died or were sold away. Hastings, Brooks, and several other concerned citizens brought this information to local authorities. In 1842 Georgia, legal protections for enslaved people were minimal, and local authorities were generally reluctant to interfere with how a plantation owner managed his property. But the specific allegations were serious enough, and the social pressure from multiple respected citizens was strong enough that the local sheriff agreed to investigate. On October 12, 1842, Sheriff Thomas Willoughby, accompanied by several deputies, Reverend Hastings, Samuel Brooks, and several other witnesses, went to the Thornton estate with a warrant to search the premises. Marcus Thornton initially refused to allow the search, claiming it was an illegal invasion of his property rights. But Sheriff Willoughby, backed by the authority of the warrant and the presence of multiple witnesses, insisted. The group made their way to the main house over Marcus's loud objections and threats of legal action. Marcus demanded to know who had made accusations against him and threatened revenge against whoever had slandered his good name. But the sheriff and his group were determined. They entered the house and began searching for access to the basement. The basement was accessed through a locked door in the kitchen area, with the key kept by Marcus personally. When Marcus refused to provide the key, the sheriff had his deputies break down the door. What they found on the other side would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives, and would shock the conscience of even the slavery-accepting society of Georgia in 1842. The stairs led down into darkness. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of human waste, unwashed bodies, sickness, and despair. As the group descended with lanterns, they began to hear sounds, crying, whimpering, movement in the darkness. When they reached the bottom of the stairs and raised their lanterns, they saw the full horror of what Marcus Thornton had created. The basement consisted of 3 large connected rooms. In these rooms were 23 children, ranging from a little girl of approximately 3 years old to a young man of about 16. There were also 7 women, ranging in age from their 20s to their 40s. All of them were in terrible condition, malnourished, filthy, some showing signs of disease and untreated injuries. Many were partially or fully naked, as clothing was apparently provided only sporadically. The children stared at the strangers with a mixture of fear and confusion, many having never seen so many people at once, some of the youngest having perhaps never seen anyone except the women who cared for them and Jacob Carver who brought their food. The women tried to shield the children, instinctively protecting them even from potential rescuers, because they had learned that any stranger represented potential danger. One woman, later identified as Sarah, who was approximately 30 years old, stepped forward and asked in a trembling voice if they had come to take the children away to be sold. When told that they were there to help, Sarah began to weep, as did several of the other women and older children. Sheriff Willoughby and the others with him were stunned into silence. Even in a society that accepted slavery, that viewed enslaved people as property, this level of cruelty and degradation shocked them. Reverend Hastings, who had suspected something terrible was happening, found the reality worse than anything he had imagined. Several of the men present became physically ill at the sight and smell of the basement. The group began bringing the women and children up out of the basement into the daylight. Many of the children had never been outside and reacted with fear and pain to the brightness of the sun, covering their eyes and crying. The younger children clung to the women who had cared for them. The older children, particularly those who remembered life before the basement, reacted with a mixture of joy and disbelief, hardly able to comprehend that they were finally being released from their prison. Marcus Thornton was immediately arrested and charged with numerous crimes, though the specific charges were complicated by the fact that the women and children were legally his property under the laws of 1842 Georgia. The most serious charges related to the concealment of property for the purpose of evading taxes and record-keeping requirements, as well as fraud related to the false documentation he had provided when selling children. The moral horror of what he had done was clear to everyone involved, but the legal framework of a slave society made it difficult to charge him with crimes against people who were legally defined as property. Jacob Carver was also arrested and proved more willing to talk than Marcus. Carver provided detailed information about the operation in exchange for a promise of a reduced sentence. He testified that Marcus had been running the basement operation for at least 12 years, that dozens of children had been born there and later sold, that several women had died in the basement from complications of pregnancy or from disease, and had been buried secretly on the plantation grounds. Carver's testimony was crucial in establishing the full scope of Marcus's crimes. The 23 children and 7 women rescued from the basement were taken to a building in town where they received medical care, food, and clothing. Local women, horrified by their condition, organized to provide care and support. Doctors examined all of them and found various health problems: malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, respiratory ailments from the poor air in the basement, infections, and in several cases, serious illnesses that required extended treatment. The psychological condition of the children was perhaps even more concerning than their physical health. The youngest children knew nothing but the basement and were terrified of open spaces, bright light, and strangers. They clung to the women who had cared for them in the basement, the only maternal figures they had ever known. The middle-aged children, roughly 6 to 12 years old, showed signs of severe trauma and developmental delays. Many could barely speak, having had minimal interaction and no education. The older teenagers, who remembered life before the basement or who had been above ground occasionally, showed signs of depression, anxiety, and what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The women's stories gradually emerged as they began to trust their rescuers and realized they were not going to be returned to the basement. Sarah, who seemed to be the eldest of the women and who the others looked to for leadership, told investigators that she had been imprisoned in the basement for 11 years. She had been taken from the fields when she was 19 years old, brought to the basement, and had not left it since except for a few occasions when she was allowed out at night for fresh air. She had given birth to 5 children in that basement, 4 of whom had been taken away and sold when they reached approximately 10 years old. Her youngest child, a girl of about 6, was among the 23 children rescued. Another woman, Rebecca, was approximately 25 years old and had been in the basement for 7 years. She told of being purchased by Marcus specifically for the basement operation, having been brought from a plantation in South Carolina with the promise that she was being bought to work as a house servant. Instead, she was immediately taken to the basement and imprisoned. She had given birth to 3 children, 2 of whom had been sold, and one of whom, a boy of about 4, was among those rescued. The women described the horror of their existence, the constant pregnancies, the fear every time a child reached the age when they would be taken away, the deaths of children who were born sick or who became ill in the terrible conditions of the basement, the complete powerlessness and despair of their situation. They described Jacob Carver's cruelty and Marcus's cold indifference on the rare occasions when he visited the basement to inspect his inventory. As news of the discovery spread, it created a sensation throughout Georgia and beyond. Newspapers in the North seized on the story as evidence of slavery's inherent cruelty and the moral bankruptcy of the system. Abolitionist papers published detailed accounts and used the Thornton basement as a rallying point for their cause. Even in the South, where slavery was defended as a natural and beneficial institution, many people were horrified by what Marcus had done, seeing it as an aberration that brought shame to all slaveholders. But the question remained, what would happen to the 23 children and 7 women who had been rescued? They were legally still Marcus Thornton's property, even after his arrest. Under the laws of Georgia in 1842, they could not simply be set free without legal proceedings, and even then, freed black people faced severe restrictions and dangers in the South. A legal battle ensued that would last for months. Abolitionists and sympathetic lawyers argued that the children and women should be freed based on the cruel and fraudulent nature of their enslavement. They argued that Marcus had violated even the minimal legal protections that existed for enslaved people, that he had essentially kidnapped and imprisoned them for illegal purposes. Marcus's lawyers, and he could afford the best, argued that regardless of how he had treated his property, it was still his property under the law, and that the state had no right to seize it without compensation. The case became a test of whether there were any limits to what a slaveholder could do to the people he enslaved. Could cruelty, even extreme cruelty, justify legal intervention in a system built on the premise that enslaved people were property to be used as their owners saw fit? The answer, unfortunately, was largely no. While Marcus was convicted of fraud and tax evasion related to his false documentation and failure to properly record his property, the courts ruled that the women and children remained enslaved and would be sold to settle Marcus's debts and pay the fines from his conviction. This outcome outraged abolitionists and sympathetic Southerners alike. Reverend Hastings, who had played a crucial role in discovering the basement, worked tirelessly to raise money to purchase the freedom of the women and children. He gave speeches in northern cities, published articles, and appealed to churches and charitable organizations. Samuel Brooks contributed a substantial sum of his own money and convinced other Georgia businessmen to contribute as well, arguing that allowing these particular people to remain enslaved after what they had endured would be a permanent stain on Georgia's honor. Over the course of several months, enough money was raised to purchase the freedom of all 7 women and 23 children. Legal documents were prepared, manumission papers were filed, and in the spring of 1843, approximately 6 months after their rescue from the basement, the women and children were legally freed. But freedom in the South was dangerous for black people, even for those who were legally free. There were immediate concerns about their safety and their future. A plan was developed to transport the freed women and children to the North, where they would have better opportunities and greater safety. Several abolitionist organizations helped coordinate this effort, providing funds for transportation and arranging for places for the families to live once they reached the North. The logistics were complicated by the fact that several of the women and children were not in good enough health to travel, requiring extended medical care before they could make the journey. The children presented particular challenges. The youngest ones had known nothing but the basement and had extreme difficulty adjusting to life above ground. They needed constant care and reassurance. The middle-aged children had significant developmental delays and would require extensive education and support to reach anything approaching normal functioning. The teenagers, having lived through years of horror during their formative years, struggled with the psychological aftermath of their trauma. Several of the women made the decision to stay together, having formed bonds during their years of shared suffering in the basement. Sarah, as the eldest and most respected among them, became a maternal figure to many of the children, even those who were not biologically hers. The children, for their part, had trouble understanding the concept of biological parentage, having been raised communally in the basement where all the women cared for all the children. The concept that they now had individual families to belong to was confusing and sometimes distressing to them. In the summer of 1843, the freed women and children began their journey north. They traveled in several groups over several weeks, accompanied by abolitionist escorts who helped ensure their safety. The journey was difficult, particularly for those who had spent years in the basement and found travel exhausting and disorienting. But eventually, all of them reached the north, settling primarily in Massachusetts and New York, where abolitionist communities welcomed them and provided support. The process of healing and adjustment would take years, and for some, full recovery was never achieved. The children who had been youngest when rescued, who had spent their most formative years in the basement, struggled with permanent developmental and psychological issues. Many never fully learned to read or write beyond a basic level. Social interactions remained difficult for them throughout their lives. The constant darkness of the basement had affected some of their eyesight. The malnutrition had stunted their growth and affected their health. The older children and the women fared somewhat better, though they too carried permanent scars from their years of imprisonment and abuse. Sarah eventually married a free black man in Massachusetts and lived to the age of 68, becoming a powerful voice in the abolitionist movement and telling her story to audiences throughout the North. Rebecca also married and had several more children, living to the age of 53. But both women suffered from recurring health problems related to their years in the basement, and both spoke of nightmares that never fully went away. As for Marcus Thornton, his fate was less severe than many thought it should be. He was convicted of fraud, tax evasion, and illegal disposal of property related to the women who had died in the basement and been buried without reporting their deaths. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but served only 5 before being released due to ill health. His plantation was seized to pay his fines and legal fees. His family's wealth was largely destroyed, and his name became synonymous with cruelty and depravity even in the South. Marcus emerged from prison in 1848 a broken man, his health destroyed, his reputation ruined, and his family's fortune gone. He lived in poverty and obscurity for the remaining 3 years of his life, dying in 1851 at the age of 62. Some saw this as just punishment for his crimes. Others, particularly abolitionists, argued that he had gotten off far too easily, that he should have faced execution or, at minimum, life imprisonment for the suffering he had caused. Jacob Carver, the overseer who had directly managed the basement operation and inflicted much of the day-to-day cruelty on the imprisoned women and children, served 8 years in prison and was released in 1850. He left Georgia and was never heard from again. Some believed he went west, possibly to Texas or California. Others thought he might have met with vigilante justice from people who felt the legal system had been too lenient with him. The Thornton estate itself, once a symbol of wealth and status, fell into ruin. No one wanted to purchase property associated with such horror. The mansion stood empty for several years, gradually deteriorating. Local people avoided it, considering it cursed. In 1855, the house was destroyed by fire under suspicious circumstances. Some believed it was deliberate arson, that someone had decided the physical reminder of what had happened there should be erased. The basement where the 23 children had been imprisoned was filled in with rubble when the house burned, becoming a buried tomb for the memories of suffering that had taken place there. The discovery of the Thornton basement had significant impact beyond the immediate rescue of the women and children imprisoned there. It became a powerful tool for abolitionists in their arguments against slavery. They pointed to the Thornton case as evidence that slavery inherently led to such horrors, that a system which treated human beings as property would inevitably result in extremes of cruelty when profit was at stake. Southern defenders of slavery argued that Marcus Thornton was an aberration, that his crimes were individual moral failings rather than inherent to the system itself. But the Thornton case, combined with other revelations about the brutality of slavery, helped shift public opinion in the North. More moderate Northerners who had previously been willing to tolerate slavery as a Southern institution that was not their concern began to see it as a moral evil that affected all Americans. The case contributed to the growing sectional tension that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The case also had immediate legal impacts in Georgia. The state legislature passed new laws requiring better documentation and inspection of enslaved people, ostensibly to prevent future cases like the Thornton basement. These laws were weakly enforced and full of loopholes that protected slaveholders' rights over their property, but they represented at least some acknowledgement that there needed to be limits on what enslavers could do. Historians have studied the Thornton case extensively, seeing it as a window into one of the darkest aspects of American slavery, the deliberate breeding and selling of human beings for profit. While Marcus Thornton's specific operation, with its hidden basement full of children, was unusual in its extreme secretiveness and cruelty, the basic practice of forced breeding was common throughout the South. Enslaved women were routinely forced to bear children who would then be enslaved from birth, and these children were frequently sold away from their families. The Thornton case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of enslaved women to sexual exploitation. While Marcus's specific focus was on producing children to sell rather than on sexual gratification, the women imprisoned in his basement were subjected to forced reproduction that constituted a form of sustained sexual violence. This was not unusual in slavery. Enslaved women throughout the South were regularly subjected to rape and forced reproduction by enslavers and overseers. What made the Thornton case different was primarily the scale and the systematic, hidden nature of the operation. Modern psychologists who have studied the accounts of the rescued children and women have identified patterns consistent with severe trauma, including what we now call complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The children in particular showed symptoms that are now associated with extreme early childhood trauma, developmental delays, attachment disorders, difficulty with emotional regulation, and in some cases, dissociative symptoms. The fact that any of them were able to go on to live relatively normal lives after such extreme early trauma speaks to human resilience, but also to the importance of the care and support they received after their rescue. The story of Isaiah, the enslaved man who risked everything to get word to Reverend Hastings about the basement, deserves particular attention. Isaiah's brave act of resistance, reaching out to someone who might be able to help despite the enormous personal risk, was instrumental in the rescue of the 23 children and 7 women. After Marcus's arrest, Isaiah was freed as part of the legal settlement and traveled north with his sister Sarah, who was indeed one of the women imprisoned in the basement. Isaiah lived in Massachusetts for the rest of his life, working as a carpenter and becoming active in the Underground Railroad, helping other enslaved people escape to freedom. He died in 1879 at the age of 63, having lived to see the end of slavery and the beginning of Reconstruction. The 23 children who were rescued from the basement all had different outcomes in their lives after freedom. Some were adopted by abolitionist families and received education and opportunities that helped them overcome their traumatic early years. Others struggled throughout their lives with the physical and psychological effects of their years of imprisonment. Several of the children died young from health problems related to their years in the basement. But others lived long lives and had children and grandchildren of their own, becoming part of the growing free black communities in the North. One of the children, a boy named Thomas who was approximately 8 years old when rescued, became particularly notable in later life. Thomas was adopted by a Quaker family in Massachusetts who provided him with extensive education and support. Despite significant early developmental delays, Thomas proved to be highly intelligent once given the opportunity to learn. He eventually became a teacher himself, working in schools for black children in Massachusetts. In the 1870s and 1880s, Thomas wrote and spoke extensively about his experiences in the Thornton basement, providing one of the few first-hand accounts from the perspective of the children themselves. Thomas's writings are heartbreaking in their descriptions of what it was like to grow up in that basement. He wrote about the constant darkness, the cold and damp, the inadequate food, the sounds of other children crying at night. He wrote about the confusion of not understanding why they were kept hidden, about the fear every time Jacob Carver came down the stairs, about the desperate hope that someday someone would rescue them. He also wrote about the women who cared for them in the basement, how they tried to create some sense of normalcy and comfort for the children despite the impossible conditions, how they told stories and sang songs to help the children endure. Thomas's writings also describe the trauma of suddenly being brought up into the light after years in darkness, the confusion and fear of being surrounded by strangers, the difficulty of adjusting to freedom after having known only imprisonment. He wrote honestly about his struggles with education, with social interaction, with nightmares and anxiety that persisted for decades after his rescue. But he also wrote about the kindness of his adoptive family, about the joy of learning to read and discovering books, about the slow process of healing and building a life worth living. The women who had been imprisoned in the basement, beyond Sarah and Rebecca, also had varied outcomes. Two of the younger women, Martha and Celia, both in their early 20s when rescued, married and had families in the North. They lived relatively quiet lives, apparently preferring not to speak publicly about their experiences. Harriet, one of the older women, became involved in the abolitionist movement and spoke at several public gatherings, though these appearances were difficult for her, and she eventually stopped due to the emotional toll of constantly reliving her trauma. Two of the women, whose names were recorded only as Lucy and Jane, struggled significantly with mental health issues after their rescue. The years of imprisonment, forced pregnancy, and trauma had taken a severe psychological toll that they were never able to fully overcome. Both women spent time in institutions for mental health treatment and died relatively young. Their struggles were not due to any inherent weakness, but were the natural consequences of the sustained horror they had endured. The seventh woman, an older woman named Esther who was in her 40s when rescued, had apparently been in the basement for the entire duration of the operation, approximately 12 years. She had borne 8 children in that basement, all of whom had been sold away except for one boy who was among the 23 rescued children. Esther's physical health was severely compromised by her years of imprisonment and repeated pregnancies under such terrible conditions. She lived only 3 years after her rescue, dying in 1846 at approximately 50 years old, her body worn out from years of suffering. The rescue of the 23 children and 7 women from the Thornton basement was not the end of the story. Investigations following the discovery of the basement led to other disturbing findings. Excavations on the Thornton plantation grounds located several unmarked graves containing the remains of women and children who had apparently died in the basement or shortly after being removed from it. The exact number was difficult to determine due to the condition of the remains, but at least 6 individuals were found, possibly more. The investigations also attempted to track what had happened to the children who had been sold from the basement before the operation was discovered. This proved extremely difficult due to the false documentation Marcus had provided and the fact that the children had been sold to buyers across multiple states. Some children were located and their situations verified, but many were never found. It's likely that some of these children lived out their lives in slavery under false identities, never knowing their true origins or that there were people who had tried to find them. The Thornton case raised uncomfortable questions about how many other similar operations might exist, undiscovered and ongoing. Were there other basements full of hidden children? Were there other enslavers conducting secret breeding operations? The investigations following the Thornton discovery found evidence suggesting that while Marcus's specific operation was unusual in its scale and systematization, variations on the practice were more common than anyone wanted to admit. Several other enslavers in Georgia and surrounding states were investigated based on tips from enslaved people and suspicious patterns in sale records, though none were found to match the extreme nature of the Thornton basement. The psychological impact on the people of Milledgeville and surrounding areas should not be underestimated. The discovery that such horror had been happening in their midst, literally under the ground beneath a respected plantation owner's house, was traumatic for the community. Many people felt guilt that they had not discovered it sooner, that they had ignored warning signs or dismissed rumors. Others felt betrayed that someone they had known socially, had done business with, had considered a respectable member of the community, could have been capable of such cruelty. The case also created divisions within the community. Some people wanted to examine how such a thing had been possible, and whether the system of slavery itself made such horrors more likely. Others preferred to view Marcus Thornton as a uniquely evil individual, whose crimes said nothing about slavery as an institution. These divisions reflected the larger national debate about slavery that was intensifying in the 1840s and would eventually tear the country apart. Reverend William Hastings, whose suspicions had initiated the investigation that led to the discovery of the basement, became a committed abolitionist after witnessing what he found there. He returned to Massachusetts and became an active speaker and organizer in the abolitionist movement, frequently referencing the Thornton basement in his speeches and writings. He worked closely with Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and other prominent abolitionists, helping to raise money to purchase the freedom of enslaved people and supporting the Underground Railroad. Hastings wrote a detailed account of the discovery of the Thornton basement, published in 1844 under the title The Hidden Children, a true account of the Thornton horror. The book was widely read in the North and contributed to growing anti-slavery sentiment. It included interviews with the rescued women and children, descriptions of the conditions in the basement, and Hastings's analysis of how such a horror could occur within the slavery system. The book was banned in most southern states, but copies circulated secretly among both enslaved people and whites who had doubts about slavery. Samuel Brooks, the merchant whose business suspicions had combined with Hastings's moral concerns to trigger the investigation, faced social and economic consequences for his role in exposing Marcus Thornton. Some in the Georgia business community viewed him as a traitor who had violated the unwritten code that whites did not interfere in other whites' management of their enslaved people. Brooks's business suffered initially, but he eventually recovered and continued to live in Milledgeville. He became more cautious about expressing any views that might be seen as critical of slavery, learning that there were limits to how much dissent the community would tolerate. The legal proceedings related to the Thornton case dragged on for years. Beyond the criminal case against Marcus and Jacob Carver, there were civil suits from various parties claiming damages or ownership of various assets. The complexity of sorting out what property belonged to Marcus, what had been gained through fraudulent means, and what should be used to compensate victims created a legal tangle that took years to resolve. By the time all the cases were settled, most of Marcus's assets had been consumed by legal fees, fines, and the payments made to purchase the freedom of the women and children. The case also had implications for how enslaved people could testify in legal proceedings. In most southern states, enslaved people could not testify against white people in court, which made it very difficult to prosecute crimes committed against them. In the Thornton case, the testimony of Jacob Carver, a white man, had been crucial in establishing what had happened. But there had also been pressure to allow the rescued women to testify about their experiences. While the Georgia courts ultimately did not fully overturn the prohibition on enslaved people testifying against whites, they did allow written depositions from the freed women to be entered into evidence in the civil proceedings. This represented a small crack in the legal wall that protected enslavers from accountability. The children's adjustment to freedom and normal life was a long and difficult process. Beyond the physical health issues and developmental delays, they struggled with understanding social norms, with feeling safe in open spaces, and with trusting adults. The concept of education was foreign and sometimes frightening to them initially. Learning to read and write required them to sit still for extended periods and focus on abstract symbols, which was incredibly difficult for children who had spent their early years in a state of constant fear and deprivation. Several abolitionist families who took in children from the Thornton basement wrote about the challenges and the small victories in the process of helping these children heal. They wrote about the first time a child laughed spontaneously, about the gradual reduction in nightmares, about the moment when a child who had been terrified of going outside would voluntarily walk out the door. They also wrote honestly about the difficulties, the behavioral problems that stemmed from trauma, the educational challenges, the ongoing health issues, and the heartbreak of realizing that some damage was permanent, and these children would never fully recover from what had been done to them. Modern trauma specialists who have reviewed the historical accounts of the Thornton children note that despite the limited understanding of psychology in the 1840s, many of the approaches used by the families who cared for them were actually quite appropriate. The provision of safety, stability, patience, and unconditional care, the gradual exposure to new experiences, the understanding that healing would take time, these are all principles that modern trauma therapy would endorse. That any of the children were able to live successful lives is a testament both to their own resilience and to the care they received. The Thornton basement itself, after the mansion burned in 1855, became a site of mixed memory. Some people wanted to forget it had ever existed, to let the physical evidence of the horror be buried and forgotten. Others argued that it should be remembered as a warning, as evidence of what slavery could lead to, as a memorial to the suffering that had occurred there. For many years, the site was simply abandoned, the rubble from the burned mansion covering the filled-in basement. In the post-Civil War period, during Reconstruction, there was renewed interest in the Thornton case. Formerly enslaved people in Georgia who had heard stories about the basement came forward with additional information about Marcus Thornton's operations and other similar cases they knew about. These testimonies helped historians and investigators build a more complete picture of the internal slave trade and the various methods enslavers used to maximize profits from forced reproduction. In the 1870s, a group of formerly enslaved people in Georgia, with support from Northern philanthropists, erected a small memorial marker near the site of the former Thornton estate. The marker, which still exists today, reads, "In memory of the women and children imprisoned in darkness on this site, and all those who suffered under slavery. May their stories never be forgotten." The marker has become a site of pilgrimage for people interested in this history, and ceremonies are occasionally held there to honor the memory of the victims. The descendants of the Thornton basement survivors have had varied relationships with this family history. Some have researched extensively and become active in preserving and sharing the story. Others have preferred not to focus on this traumatic aspect of their family's past. There is no single right way to deal with such a legacy, and descendants have made individual choices about how much to engage with this history. One remarkable effort to document and preserve the story came in the 1930s, when a historian named Dr. Clara Morrison conducted extensive interviews with elderly people who had been children or young adults at the time of the basement's discovery. Dr. Morrison was able to collect first-hand accounts from people who had been present when the basement was opened, who had helped care for the rescued children, or who had been involved in the legal proceedings. She also located several surviving individuals who had themselves been children in the basement and were willing to share their memories. Her research, published in 1938 as The Thornton Case, a study in slavery's extremes, remains the most comprehensive scholarly treatment of the case. Dr. Morrison's work revealed additional details about the operation that had not been previously documented. Through interviews with people who had worked on the Thornton plantation, she learned about the methods Marcus and Jacob Carver had used to keep the basement operation secret. Workers on the plantation were strictly forbidden from going near the main house. Those who worked in the house were rotated frequently and were never allowed to work in the kitchen area where access to the basement was located. Marcus's wife, who apparently knew about the basement operation but was either complicit or too frightened to speak out, died in 1838, 4 years before the discovery, taking whatever knowledge she had to her grave. The question of Marcus Thornton's wife's complicity remains unresolved. Some historians believe she must have known what was happening, but chose to look the way, valuing her own comfort and social position over the suffering of the women and children in the basement. Others suggest she may have been a victim herself in some sense, trapped in a marriage to a cruel man and afraid of what he might do if she challenged him. Still others believe she may have been genuinely unaware, though this seems unlikely given that the basement was accessed through her own kitchen. Marcus and his wife had 3 children of their own, all of whom were adults by the time the basement was discovered. These children faced social ostracism and stigma after their father's crimes were exposed. They all left Georgia and tried to build lives elsewhere, changing their names to escape association with the Thornton name. The question of what they knew about their father's operation, and when they knew, it has never been satisfactorily answered. None of them ever spoke publicly about the case, and any private records or letters they might have left have not been found or have been deliberately destroyed. The case raises profound questions about complicity and knowledge. How many people on the Thornton plantation suspected something was happening, but chose not to investigate or speak out? How many people in Milledgeville heard rumors but dismissed them as too extreme to be true? How many business associates noticed suspicious patterns in Marcus's transactions, but decided it was not their concern? The discovery of the basement forced many people to confront uncomfortable questions about what they had known, what they had suspected, and what they had chosen to ignore. These questions remain relevant today when we consider modern forms of exploitation and abuse that happen in plain sight, but remain undetected, because people choose not to see or choose not to act. The Thornton case reminds us that evil often flourishes not because of the actions of a single perpetrator, but because of the inaction of many people who could have intervened, but chose not to. The children's stories, as they lived out their lives in freedom, showed the long-term effects of early childhood trauma, but also the possibility of resilience and recovery. Several of the children went on to have families of their own, to hold jobs, to participate in their communities. They carried scars, both physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives, but they also demonstrated that it was possible to build meaningful lives after such devastating beginnings. Their survival and their successes are a testament to human resilience and to the power of care, support, and opportunity to help people heal from even the most severe trauma. One of the most moving aspects of the survivors' stories is how many of them went on to dedicate their lives to helping others. Several became involved in abolitionist work before the Civil War, using their own experiences to illustrate the horrors of slavery. After emancipation, several worked in schools for formerly enslaved children, in churches serving the black community, or in other forms of service. Having survived such suffering themselves, they seemed determined to help reduce the suffering of others. This transformation of trauma into compassion and action is another testament to the human spirit's capacity to find meaning and purpose even in the darkest experiences. The Thornton case also had implications for the development of child welfare concepts. While the modern concept of child abuse as a specific legal category did not exist in the 1840s, the public reaction to the condition of the children in the Thornton basement contributed to growing awareness that children needed special protection. The case was cited in later years by early child welfare advocates as an example of why societies needed to protect children from extreme abuse, even when those children were legally considered property. In 1998, the site of the former Thornton estate was designated as a historical landmark by the state of Georgia. A small museum and educational center was established nearby, dedicated to telling the story of the Thornton basement and the broader history of slavery in Georgia. The museum includes exhibits on the internal slave trade, forced breeding practices, the experiences of enslaved women, and the specific story of the 23 children and 7 women rescued from the basement. It also addresses the legacy of slavery and its ongoing effects on American society. The museum has been controversial, with some local residents arguing that it focuses too much on negative history and unfairly maligns Georgia's reputation. Others argue that confronting this difficult history honestly is necessary for healing and for preventing similar horrors in the future. The debate over the museum reflects broader ongoing debates about how societies should remember and commemorate painful histories. Educational programs at the museum use the Thornton case to teach about slavery, human rights, the psychology of trauma, and the importance of intervention when abuse is suspected. School groups visit and participate in age-appropriate programs that help them understand this history and connect it to contemporary issues of exploitation and human rights. The museum has become an important educational resource and a place for reflection on this dark chapter of American history. Descendants of the survivors have mixed feelings about the museum. Some appreciate that the story is being told and that their ancestors are being honored. Others feel uncomfortable with the public attention and prefer to keep this family history private. The museum has tried to balance the need to tell this important historical story with respect for the privacy and feelings of descendants. As of 2024, there are still people living who are direct descendants of the 23 children rescued from the Thornton basement. These descendants carry with them the legacy of survival, resilience, and the ongoing work of healing from historical trauma. Some have become active in civil rights work, in efforts to address systemic racism, or in other forms of social justice activism. Others have chosen to live quiet private lives. All carry within them the DNA and the family history of people who survived one of the darkest episodes in American history. The story of the Thornton basement is difficult to hear and difficult to tell. It represents human cruelty at its worst, the deliberate exploitation and abuse of the most vulnerable, the prioritization of profit over human dignity, the systematic dehumanization of women and children for economic gain. But it is also a story of survival, of people who endured unimaginable suffering and somehow found ways to go on living, of helpers who risked their own safety to rescue those in danger, and of communities that, however imperfectly, ultimately chose to act when confronted with evidence of extreme abuse. The 23 children who were brought up from that basement into the light in October of 1842 went on to live lives that mattered. They had children and grandchildren. They contributed to their communities. They bore witness to what had been done to them and helped ensure that the world would know about this horror. Their story is preserved not as a sensational tale to entertain, but as an important historical truth that must be remembered and learned from. In remembering the Thornton basement, we honor the memory of those who suffered there. We remember the women who tried to protect and care for children in impossible circumstances. We remember Isaiah, whose courage in reaching out for help led to the rescue. We remember Reverend Hastings and Samuel Brooks, and the others who chose to investigate and act despite social pressure, to ignore what was happening. And we remember the 23 children who emerged from darkness into light and built lives for themselves, despite the most difficult possible beginning. The basement itself is gone, filled in and buried under the ruins of the burned mansion, reclaimed by earth and time. But the memory of what happened there remains, preserved in historical records, in scholarly studies, in the museum and memorial, and in the collective consciousness of all who learn this story. It remains as a warning about what humans are capable of when they view other humans as property, as a call to action when we suspect abuse is occurring, and as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit even in the face of sustained cruelty. As we conclude this account of the Thornton basement and the 23 children who were hidden there for years, we must ask ourselves, what are the modern equivalents of such horrors? Where today are vulnerable people being exploited, abused, and hidden from view? How often do we hear rumors or see signs of something wrong, but choose not to investigate or act? The specifics of the Thornton case are historical, but the dynamics it represents, exploitation of the vulnerable, profit prioritized over human welfare, people choosing to look away rather than confront difficult truths, these remain relevant today. The legacy of the Thornton basement is not just a historical curiosity or a horror story from the past. It is a call to vigilance, to compassion, and to action. It reminds us to listen when vulnerable people try to tell us they are being harmed. It reminds us to investigate when something seems wrong even if it's uncomfortable or socially awkward to do so. It reminds us that systems which treat some people as less than fully human will inevitably produce horrors, and that we must continually work to create and maintain legal and social structures that protect the vulnerable. The 23 children of the Thornton basement are gone now, as are their children and most of their grandchildren. But their story lives on, passed down through descendants, preserved in historical records, taught in classrooms, and remembered by all who learn about this dark chapter of American history. Their suffering was real. Their survival was remarkable. Their legacy calls us to be better, to care more, and to never allow such horrors to happen again. This is what we owe to their memory, and this is why their story must continue to be told. The years following the Civil War brought new dimensions to understanding the Thornton basement case. As formerly enslaved people gained the freedom to speak more openly about their experiences, additional information about Marcus Thornton's operations and similar practices throughout the South came to light. Historians during the Reconstruction era began collecting testimonies from people who had survived slavery, and several of these accounts referenced the Thornton case or described similar hidden breeding operations on other plantations. One particularly significant testimony came from a woman named Elizabeth Porter, who had worked as a house servant on a plantation adjacent to the Thornton estate in the 1830s. In a deposition given in 1867, Elizabeth described how enslaved people in the area had known something terrible was happening at the Thornton plantation, even if they didn't know the full details. She recounted conversations whispered in secret among enslaved workers when they encountered each other at church gatherings, or when hired out to work together on projects. Elizabeth testified that there had been a network of information among enslaved people, a way of passing warnings and knowledge that was invisible to white enslavers. Through this network, word had spread that women were disappearing at the Thornton plantation, that strange sounds could be heard from the main house at night, and that Marcus Thornton was involved in some particularly cruel aspect of the slave trade. But this knowledge had been powerless knowledge. Enslaved people who suspected what was happening had no legal recourse, no way to report crimes to authorities who would listen, no means to intervene to help the victims. This testimony illuminated an important aspect of the Thornton case that had been underexplored: the knowledge and helplessness of the enslaved community who suspected but could not act. It raised painful questions about collective trauma and the psychological burden of knowing that people were suffering but being unable to help them. How many enslaved people had lived with the guilt and frustration of suspecting what was in that basement but being unable to do anything about it? How many had passed the Thornton mansion and wondered about the women and children hidden below? Another significant post-war revelation came from a man named Benjamin Carver, nephew of Jacob Carver, the overseer who had managed the basement operation. Benjamin had been a young man in the early 1840s and had occasionally visited his uncle at the Thornton plantation. In testimony given in 1870, Benjamin stated that his uncle had once, while drunk, made oblique references to special work he did for Marcus Thornton that was more profitable than regular overseeing. Benjamin claimed he had not understood what his uncle meant at the time, but after the basement was discovered, he realized his uncle had been hinting at his role in the operation. Benjamin's testimony suggested that Jacob Carver had felt some need to boast about his work, even if he couldn't be explicit about it, revealing a psychology common among those who commit atrocities: the desire for recognition of what they see as skill or achievement, even when that achievement is fundamentally cruel and criminal. This need to be recognized, even obliquely, for doing terrible things would become a subject of study for later psychologists, trying to understand the minds of people who participate in systematic abuse. The Reconstruction period also brought renewed efforts to locate the children who had been sold from the Thornton basement before its discovery. The Freedmen's Bureau, established to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom, dedicated resources to reuniting families that had been separated by slavery. Several investigators working for the Bureau specifically focused on trying to track the children sold by Marcus Thornton. These efforts met with limited success. The false documentation Marcus had created made it extremely difficult to trace where the children had gone. Many of them had been sold to buyers in other states, who had then resold them, creating chains of ownership that were nearly impossible to follow decades later. Additionally, many of the children would have been given new names by their subsequent enslavers, further obscuring their identities and origins. However, there were some successes. In 1868, investigators located a woman in Alabama named Mary who had been approximately 8 years old when sold from the Thornton basement in 1838. Mary had fragmentary memories of her early years in the basement and of being suddenly taken away and sold. Through a combination of these memories and documentation that investigators were able to piece together, they established with reasonable certainty that Mary was one of the Thornton basement children. Mary's reaction to this discovery was complex. She had lived for 30 years not knowing the full truth of her origins, having constructed a life story based on what her subsequent enslavers had told her and on her own fragmented memories. Learning that she had been born and spent her early years in such horrific circumstances was traumatic in itself, reopening wounds she had not fully known existed. At the same time, Mary expressed gratitude at finally understanding her own history and no longer having the confusion of memories that didn't match the story she had been told about her origins. Mary was connected with Sarah, the woman who had been the maternal figure to many children in the basement and who had survived and was living in Massachusetts. Sarah believed Mary was one of the children she had helped care for, though she could not be certain after so many years. The two women corresponded and eventually met, a reunion that was both joyful and painful as they shared memories of the basement and the years that had followed. Several other possible Thornton basement children were identified with varying degrees of certainty, but many were never found. The best estimates suggest that perhaps 15 to 20 children were sold from the basement before its discovery, and of these, only 4 or 5 were ever identified with reasonable certainty. The others disappeared into the vastness of the slave system, their true origins lost forever. The post-war period also brought scholarly attention to the Thornton case from early sociologists and historians trying to document and understand slavery's full impact. One significant study, published in 1875 by historian Dr. James Whitfield, analyzed the Thornton case in the context of the broader practice of slave breeding throughout the South. Dr. Whitfield's research revealed that while the specific circumstances of the Thornton basement were unusual, the fundamental practice of forcing enslaved women to bear children for profit was widespread and systematic. Dr. Whitfield documented that in the Upper South states, where tobacco cultivation was declining and cotton was less profitable than further south, slave breeding had become a major economic activity. Virginia in particular had become known as a breeding state, where enslaved people were born and raised specifically to be sold to the cotton plantations of the Deep South. While most of this breeding was not done in hidden basements like the Thornton operation, the fundamental violation was the same: women forced to bear children who would be enslaved from birth and often sold away from their mothers. The Thornton case, Dr. Whitfield argued, was an extreme example that revealed the logical endpoint of treating human reproduction as an economic activity. If enslaved people were property that could be bred for profit, then operations like Marcus Thornton's were simply the most efficient version of that practice. The horror of the Thornton basement was not an aberration from the system of slavery, but rather a particularly pure expression of its fundamental dehumanization. This analysis was controversial even in the post-war North. Many white Americans, even those who had opposed slavery, were uncomfortable with unflinching examinations of slavery's sexual violence and its treatment of women's bodies as productive resources. Dr. Whitfield's work was criticized by some as unnecessarily graphic and disturbing, but it represented an important effort to fully document and understand what slavery had actually been, rather than accepting sanitized versions that minimized its cruelty. The late 19th century also saw the first comprehensive interviews with survivors of the Thornton basement who were willing and able to speak about their experiences. Thomas, the child who had become a teacher and writer, provided the most detailed first-hand account, but several other survivors also gave interviews and testimony that added to the historical record. One survivor, a woman named Anna who had been approximately 6 years old when rescued from the basement, gave an interview in 1885 that provided heartbreaking details about life in that underground prison. Anna described how the younger children had no concept that there was a world outside the basement. She said they had believed the entire universe consisted of those 3 dark rooms, that they had no vocabulary for concepts like sky or trees or sun, because they had never experienced these things. Anna described the psychological impact of suddenly being brought into the outside world. She said it had been overwhelming to the point of being painful, that her mind had struggled to process the enormous open spaces, the bright light, the countless new objects and sensations. She compared it to trying to suddenly understand a completely foreign language that contained concepts that had no equivalent in the only language you knew. The adjustment had taken years, and even in adulthood, Anna said she sometimes felt most comfortable in small, enclosed spaces, because those were what her brain had imprinted on during her formative years. Anna also spoke about the women who had cared for the children in the basement, describing them with deep affection and respect. She said these women had tried to create some sense of normalcy and security for the children despite their own suffering and trauma. They had made up stories and songs, had created games that could be played in the confined space, had taught the children to count even though they had no formal education themselves. Anna credited these women with keeping the children from complete psychological collapse, with providing the minimal emotional nurturing that allowed the children to retain some capacity for connection and growth. The survivors' accounts also provided information about the hierarchies and relationships that had developed among the imprisoned women and children. Sarah had emerged as a leader not through any formal authority, but through her strength of character and her willingness to put the needs of the children before her own. Other women had specialized roles. One had particular knowledge of medicinal plants and tried to treat illnesses with the limited resources available. Another was skilled at storytelling and helped keep the children calm during frightening times. Another was particularly good at soothing crying babies and helping the youngest children. These accounts revealed that even in the most dehumanizing circumstances, people found ways to organize themselves, to support each other, and to create social structures that provided some sense of order and meaning. The women in the Thornton basement, despite being treated as breeding machinery by Marcus Thornton, had maintained their humanity and had created a community of mutual support that had been crucial to their survival and that of the children. The early 20th century brought new approaches to understanding the Thornton case. Progressive-era reformers interested in child welfare and women's rights saw the case as a historical example that supported their arguments for stronger legal protections. They pointed to the Thornton basement as evidence of what could happen to vulnerable people when there were insufficient legal safeguards, using it to argue for child labor laws, for protections against child abuse, and for women's rights to control their own bodies and reproductive choices. Some of these reformers went further, drawing explicit connections between the forced breeding of enslaved women in the 19th century and contemporary efforts to control women's reproduction through restrictive laws and social pressure. They argued that the Thornton case should serve as a warning about the dangers of treating women's bodies as resources to be controlled by others, whether that control was exercised by individual enslavers or by state laws and social norms. These arguments were controversial and often dismissed as radical or inappropriate. But they represented early attempts to draw lessons from the Thornton case that went beyond simply condemning slavery, looking instead at the broader issues of bodily autonomy, reproductive rights, and the vulnerability of people who lack legal protections and social power. In the 1920s and 1930s, the rise of professional social work as a discipline led to new analyses of the Thornton case from the perspective of child development and trauma. Social workers and psychologists studied the accounts of the Thornton children's adjustment to freedom, looking for insights into how to help children who had experienced severe early trauma. While the theoretical frameworks of the time were limited compared to modern trauma psychology, these early studies represented important attempts to understand the long-term effects of childhood trauma and the factors that promoted resilience and recovery. One influential study, published in 1932 by social worker Margaret Chen, analyzed the life outcomes of the Thornton children who could be tracked through historical records. Chen found that several factors seemed to correlate with better outcomes: being adopted by families who provided consistent care and high levels of support, receiving education, being allowed to maintain connections with other survivors, and having opportunities to talk about their experiences rather than being forced to keep silent about their trauma. Chen's findings anticipated many conclusions that modern trauma research would later confirm: that healing from severe trauma requires safety, support, opportunity, and the ability to integrate traumatic experiences into one's life narrative rather than trying to suppress or deny them. Her work was among the first to take seriously the long-term psychological impacts of early childhood trauma and to study what helped people recover from such experiences. The mid-20th century saw the Thornton case incorporated into academic studies of slavery and American history more broadly. As universities began to take more seriously the study of African American history and the history of slavery, the Thornton basement became a case study in courses on antebellum history, the domestic slave trade, and the experiences of enslaved women. However, there was often tension between the academic study of cases like Thornton's and the descendants of the victims. Some descendants felt that academic analysis, no matter how well-intentioned, risked turning their ancestors' suffering into abstract material for scholarly debate. They argued that the Thornton case should be remembered primarily as a story of real people who suffered and survived, not as data for historical analysis. These concerns led to important conversations about the ethics of historical research into traumatic events, about who has the right to tell these stories and how they should be told, and about the responsibilities researchers have to descendants and communities affected by the histories they study. These conversations continue today and have led to more collaborative approaches where researchers work with descendant communities rather than simply studying them from outside. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s brought renewed attention to the Thornton case, as activists drew parallels between historical injustices like the Thornton basement and contemporary struggles for racial justice. Civil rights leaders sometimes reference the case in speeches and writings as an example of the depths of cruelty that racism and dehumanization could produce, and as evidence of why systemic change was necessary to address the ongoing legacies of slavery. Some activists also drew inspiration from the story of Isaiah, the enslaved man who had risked everything to get word out about the basement. They held up Isaiah as an example of resistance and courage, someone who had taken action despite enormous personal risk because he believed it was right. Isaiah's story became part of a broader effort to recover and celebrate the history of resistance to slavery, countering narratives that portrayed enslaved people as passive victims rather than active agents in their own liberation. The 1970s and 1980s saw increased interest in the Thornton case from feminist historians and scholars studying the particular experiences of enslaved women. These scholars emphasized that the Thornton basement represented an extreme example of the sexual violence and reproductive exploitation that enslaved women experienced throughout the slavery system. They argued that understanding cases like Thornton's was essential to understanding the full horror of slavery and its particular impact on women. This scholarship also connected the historical experiences of enslaved women to contemporary issues of reproductive rights, bodily autonomy, and gender-based violence. Feminist scholars argued that the Thornton case should inform current debates about who controls women's bodies, who makes decisions about reproduction, and how society protects vulnerable people from exploitation. These arguments remained controversial, but contributed to deeper understanding of the connections between historical and contemporary forms of gendered violence. In 1992, on the 150th anniversary of the discovery of the Thornton basement, a major conference was held in Milledgeville bringing together historians, descendants, psychologists, social workers, and activists to discuss the case and its implications. The conference produced a collection of papers published in 1994 as The Thornton Basement: History, Memory, and Legacy, which remains an important scholarly resource on the case. The conference also facilitated connections among descendants of the Thornton basement survivors who had previously been unaware of each other. Some of these descendants formed ongoing relationships and have worked together on various projects to preserve and share their family histories. These connections have been meaningful for many descendants, providing a sense of community with others who share this unique and difficult family heritage. One outcome of the 1992 conference was the establishment of the Thornton Basement Memorial Fund, which provides scholarships for descendants of the survivors and for students studying the history of slavery and its legacies. The fund has supported dozens of students over the past 3 decades, helping to ensure that the next generation has the education and resources to continue telling these important stories. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have also seen advances in genetic research that have added new dimensions to understanding the Thornton case. DNA analysis has been used to help verify claimed connections to Thornton basement survivors and to trace family relationships among descendants. This research has confirmed some family traditions and stories while complicating others, revealing the complex web of relationships that resulted from the forced breeding operations in the basement and the subsequent scattering of children through sale. Genetic research has also contributed to broader understanding of the internal slave trade and its demographic impacts. By analyzing DNA patterns in African American populations, researchers have been able to trace migration patterns and family separations caused by slavery. The Thornton case, with its relatively well-documented history of children being born in one location and sold to various other locations, has provided a case study for understanding how forced migrations during slavery shaped the genetic landscape of African American populations. However, this genetic research has also raised ethical questions. Some descendants have expressed discomfort with the use of DNA analysis to study their family histories, feeling that it reduces their ancestors to genetic data and echoes slavery's treatment of people as specimens to be cataloged and analyzed. Researchers have had to grapple with these concerns, developing more respectful and collaborative approaches that involve descendant communities in decisions about how genetic research is conducted and interpreted. In recent years, the Thornton case has been incorporated into discussions about reparations for slavery. Advocates for reparations have pointed to cases like Thornton's as evidence of specific, documented harms that were committed and that have had ongoing intergenerational effects. They argue that descendants of people who suffered in places like the Thornton basement have particular claims to compensation for the suffering their ancestors endured and the opportunities that were stolen from them. The descendants themselves have varied views on reparations. Some believe compensation is owed and would provide some measure of justice and acknowledgement of harm. Others are skeptical that any amount of money could adequately address what happened and worry that reparations might become a way to close the book on this history, rather than continuing the ongoing work of addressing its legacies. These debates within the descendant community reflect broader debates about reparations in American society. The Thornton case has also been referenced in contemporary discussions about human trafficking and modern slavery. Anti-trafficking advocates point to the Thornton basement as a historical example of trafficking for forced labor and sexual exploitation, drawing parallels to contemporary trafficking operations that keep victims hidden and exploit them for profit. While there are significant differences between historical chattel slavery and modern trafficking, the parallels are thought-provoking and have helped some people understand that forms of slavery and severe exploitation continue to exist in the 21st century. Educational approaches to teaching the Thornton case have evolved significantly over time. Early accounts often sensationalized the horror in ways that titillated readers, but didn't necessarily promote deeper understanding. More recent educational materials have tried to balance honest depiction of what happened with age-appropriate presentation and attention to the humanity and agency of the victims. The Museum and Educational Center near the former Thornton estate has developed sophisticated programs for different age groups. Elementary school programs focus on general concepts of fairness, kindness, and standing up for people who are being hurt, using the story of Isaiah helping the children without going into graphic details about the basement conditions. Middle school programs provide more historical context about slavery and begin to address the specific circumstances of the Thornton case. High school and adult programs engage with the full complexity of the history, including the sexual violence, the forced breeding, and the ongoing legacies of this trauma. Teachers who use the Thornton case in their classrooms report that students often find it more immediately impactful than more abstract discussions of slavery. The specificity of 23 children in a basement, the concrete details of their suffering and rescue, makes the history feel real and personal in ways that statistics about millions of enslaved people sometimes don't. However, teachers also note the challenge of addressing such traumatic material in ways that educate without traumatizing students, particularly students who are descendants of enslaved people, and for whom this history is personal family heritage. The digital age has brought new ways of preserving and sharing the Thornton story. The museum has created virtual exhibits that allow people anywhere in the world to learn about the case. Descendants have created websites and social media pages sharing family histories connected to the Thornton basement. Podcasts and YouTube videos have explored the case, bringing it to audiences who might not otherwise encounter this history. However, the digital proliferation of the Thornton story has also created challenges. Some online content sensationalizes the case or gets details wrong. There have been instances of people falsely claiming connection to the Thornton survivors to gain attention or sympathy. The museum and descendant organizations have had to work to maintain historical accuracy and to push back against misappropriation or exploitation of the story. In 2020, during the racial justice protests following George Floyd's murder, the Thornton case was referenced by some activists as an example of the historical depths of systemic racism and violence against Black people. The case was used to counter narratives that systemic racism is an abstract concept, or that the harm of slavery ended with emancipation. Activists pointed to the intergenerational trauma resulting from cases like Thornton's as evidence that the effects of slavery continue to shape African American communities today. This use of the Thornton case in contemporary activism was welcomed by some descendants and criticized by others. Some felt that using their family trauma to make political points was disrespectful. Others believed that if their ancestors' suffering could help promote justice and positive change, then sharing the story widely was honoring their memory. These different perspectives within the descendant community reflect the ongoing challenge of deciding how historical trauma should be remembered and used. Recent psychological research has examined the concept of historical trauma and its intergenerational transmission, with the Thornton case sometimes used as an example. This research suggests that severe trauma can have effects that persist across multiple generations, affecting not just those who directly experienced it, but their children and grandchildren. Mechanisms may include both environmental factors, such as parenting practices affected by trauma, and potentially epigenetic factors, where traumatic experiences may affect gene expression in ways that can be inherited. While this research is still developing and remains controversial in some aspects, it has helped explain why descendants of enslaved people, including Thornton basement survivors, sometimes struggle with psychological and health issues that seem connected to historical trauma their ancestors experienced. This research has implications for mental health treatment, suggesting that healing from historical trauma requires not just individual therapy but community-level interventions that address the collective nature of the trauma and its transmission. The COVID-19 pandemic brought new attention to health disparities affecting African Americans, and some scholars drew connections to historical trauma, including cases like Thornton's. They argued that generations of medical abuse and exploitation during slavery, including the reproductive violence exemplified by the Thornton basement, contributed to ongoing mistrust of medical institutions in Black communities and to health disparities that persist today. This analysis was controversial, but highlighted how historical events like the Thornton case continue to have relevance for understanding contemporary social issues. As we approach the 200th anniversary of the Thornton basement's discovery, which will occur in 2042, planning is underway for how to mark this significant milestone. Descendants, historians, and community members are discussing various possibilities: expanded museum exhibits, publication of new research, gatherings of descendants from across the country, educational initiatives to ensure younger generations learn this history. There is also discussion about what should happen to the actual site of the basement in the long term. The current memorial is relatively modest, and some have proposed creating a more extensive memorial and educational site. Others worry about turning a site of trauma into a major tourist attraction. These discussions reflect ongoing tensions about how to appropriately memorialize difficult history, honoring victims, educating the public, and respecting descendants while avoiding exploitation or sensationalism. The story of the Thornton basement is ultimately a story about human beings, about what humans are capable of doing to each other in systems that dehumanize and exploit, but also about human resilience, resistance, and the capacity to survive and even thrive after terrible suffering. The women who were imprisoned in that basement, who were forced to bear children in darkness, who somehow maintained their humanity and cared for those children despite their own trauma. They were remarkable people who endured what should have been unendurable. The children who grew up in that basement, who knew only darkness and confinement for their early years, who were suddenly thrust into a world they could barely comprehend, they were also remarkable. That any of them were able to adjust to freedom, to learn and grow, to build lives and families, speaks to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Isaiah, who risked everything to get word out about the basement, his act of courage saved 30 lives and exposed a system of cruelty that needed to be confronted. Reverend Hastings and Samuel Brooks, who investigated despite social pressure to ignore what was happening. They demonstrated the importance of people with privilege and power, choosing to use it to help the vulnerable rather than looking away. The story reminds us that evil often succeeds not because of the actions of monsters, but because of the inaction of ordinary people who choose not to see, not to investigate, not to intervene. But it also reminds us that courage and compassion, even in small acts, can make enormous differences. One enslaved man finding a way to send a message, one minister choosing to investigate rather than dismiss his suspicions. These acts led to the rescue of 30 people and the exposure of systematic cruelty. As we carry the memory of the Thornton basement forward, we carry both a warning and an inspiration. The warning is about what happens when we treat some people as less than fully human, when we prioritize profit over dignity, when we choose not to see suffering that is inconvenient to acknowledge. The inspiration is about human resilience, about the capacity to survive terrible suffering and still maintain humanity, about the power of resistance and courage even in the face of overwhelming oppression. The 23 children who were brought up from that basement into the October sunshine in 1842 are long gone, as are the women who cared for them in captivity, as are Isaiah and Reverend Hastings and Samuel Brooks, and all the others who played roles in this history. But their story lives on, passed down through generations, studied by scholars, taught to students, remembered by descendants, and told to anyone who will listen. We owe it to their memory to tell this story honestly and completely, neither minimizing the horror to make ourselves comfortable nor sensationalizing it for entertainment. We owe it to them to learn the lessons their story teaches about human rights, about systemic injustice, about the ongoing work of creating societies that protect the vulnerable and prevent such horrors from happening again. The basement where 23 children were hidden for years is gone, filled in and reclaimed by earth, but the memory of what happened there must never be buried. It must be preserved, studied, taught, and remembered, so that the suffering of those women and children is not forgotten, so that their survival and resistance is honored, and so that we remain vigilant against all forms of exploitation and dehumanization that continue in different forms today. This is the legacy of the Thornton basement, a history that challenges us, a memory that honors the victims, and a call to action that remains as urgent today as it was in 1842. May we prove worthy of that legacy, and may we never forget the 23 children who were hidden in darkness and the courage of all those who brought them into the light.